World History Discussions, Chapter 8, Part 6. Now we're getting to the unification of China, and yes, that's the Qin Empire, which only lasted from 221 to 207 BCE, and that's the Great Wall of China, which started under Qin Shi Huangdi 2,200 years ago. In fact, China's name, a lot of people believe, comes from Qin Empire, which isn't entirely true. If you know anything about the Chinese language, it comes from the name Zhongguo. Zhong means middle and Guo means country, so middle country, and China always considered themselves the middle of the world. Imagine that, big egos. So middle kingdom or middle country, and it also came from the porcelain that came from this part of the world, which the Europeans called China. So that's where the name comes from. But some people do say it comes from the Qin dynasty, which is kind of considered the beginning of Chinese history, even though in Chapter 5, we talked about those early dynasties right there, such as the Xia, the Shang, and the Zhou, and you can see that the Qin was much bigger than those, but also we talked about the Warring States period. You can see Qin being the westernmost of those states, and then in 221 BCE, boom, China is all unified under the Qin Empire. So we talked about the legalists and Shang Yang, and I said basically they were fascists. And Qin actually has a lot in common with Mao Zedong, which we won't get to that till 1949 CE. I think it was like chapter 35 or 36, Communist China. But you're going to see why in terms of burning books and killing intellectuals and all that there's some Mao comparisons with Qin. And one thing you might not think of is you might not think of these legalists as being socialists. They sound more fascist, but you'd be surprised. Shang Yang was pretty socialist. He encouraged peasant cultivators to move to the sparsely populated state of Qin by giving them private land plots and boosting agricultural production. Okay, not socialist, because that would be everybody shares the same land, but basically these individual land rights also weakened the economic position of the hereditary aristocrat. So yeah, very anti-elite, anti-aristocratic, which I think was a good thing, even though I generally think legalism was a bad thing, and the Qins were some very brutal people, despite putting this empire together. I definitely like the Achaemenid Persians in the previous chapter a lot better. But anyway, the new wealth generated from these peasant cultivators was then used to build a powerful army equipped with the most effective iron weapons. And in 221 BCE, Qin Shi Huangdi declared himself the first emperor. A lot of people do think this is the true beginning of Chinese history right here, even though there was 2,000 years of it before this that we talked about in Chapter 5. But anyway, ironically, this empire would only last 14 years, but it would establish the norm of centralized imperial rule that would last for 2,200 years. The Qin reduced the influence of the nobility and ruled through a centralized bureaucracy with a capital at Shangyang, not that far from modern Xi'an and not that far from the early Zhou capital of Hao before 771 BCE, when they had been forced east to Liaoyang. That was also in Chapter 5. But the rest of China was divided into provinces or districts, kind of like the Persian satraps or the states within the United States, you could say. But Qin Shi Huangdi disarmed regional military forces and destroyed any fortresses that could serve as points of rebellion or resistance. I guess they learned from the Zhou dynasty when those subordinates got a lot stronger and eventually overpowered the centralized rule and became the warring states. They didn't want to make that mistake again. But anyway, also Qin built 4,000 miles worth of roads. Sounds like the Persians and the royal roads. I'm showing you the classical empires comparisons here. And these facilitated trade and communication, even though they were actually built for military. Drafted thousands of laborers to build defensive walls, and while many walls already existed in northern and western China to keep out nomadic raiders, Qin ordered these walls to be connected into a massive defensive barrier, and that was the Great Wall of China. And now we got a Trump joke. So of course, what does Qin say? We're going to build a wall, and we're going to keep the nomadic raiders out to the north, and we're going to make them pay for that wall. Just kidding. Anyway, that's pretty much the Qin Empire. We got more on them in the very next discussion.